Welcome to the Predictable Revenue Podcast, where sales leaders teach you what's working for them so you can build it yourself.
This episode of the Predictable Revenue Podcast is brought to you by our sales coaching and consulting services. Are you looking to create repeatable, scalable, and predictable revenue? We've helped thousands of companies grow their business with tailored expert advice backed by testing to ensure they establish the best practices that will work for them. Head over to bit.ly/predictable coaching to learn more.
Welcome back to the Predictable Revenue. I'm your host, Collin Stewart. Today, I'm joined by Philipp Humm, the author of the story Selling Method. And we're going to talk about storytelling. Philipp, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot, Collin. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. I'm excited. We've done a little bit of a theme the last little bit where we've been talking about some of the tactics that salespeople need to learn as part of their trade, but maybe aren't necessarily seen as sales tactics or sales skills. I would say storytelling and choosing the right stories and telling them in the right way is one of the hardest things I've had to master, but has probably had the biggest impact on my selling career. I'm curious, maybe we can start about, why should I think I'm on board, I'm sold, but if somebody's listening, they're like, this is a sales podcast, why should I listen to two guys talk about storytelling?
For sure, yeah. So let's take a salesperson, right? And all the listeners, usually we go into these meetings and we start pitching our product and we're like, we're the greatest company on earth. We operate in 20 markets and we invest 10% in R&D. We're the coolest. And these are all beautiful facts, and you should definitely say them, right? But just think, how memorable will these be? Do you think that your buyer will remember them a day, a week, a month later? No chance, right? And so if you want to be remembered, well, you got to appeal to the emotions. And the quickest way to appeal to someone's emotions is by sharing stories.
Love that. I think one of the things I struggled with most in my career is I knew this and I understood. And I'm one of those people that grew up that, everybody around me is like, oh, he's going to be a salesperson. My granddad was a salesperson. I'm assuming his granddad and his granddad before him were all salespeople. That's not true, but let's pretend it is. But my granddad had twin brothers and they were both salespeople. But I just talked a lot. People were like, oh, you're going to be a great salesperson. And I think, maybe it was a little bit like them telling me I was going to be a great salesperson. So I was like, okay, that sounds like a good career for me. And I think that was probably 80% of it. But then when I actually got into being a salesperson, I'm like, oh, actually, this thing that everybody said was going to help me be a good salesperson is actually holding me back. I'm talking way too much. And when I started selling, we didn't have gong or chorus to record and tell you oh, it's 50%. You talk 80% and they talk 20%. You didn't have that. You just had to kind of play it by ear and sit and reflect. And I struggled. I think one of the things that I struggled the most with in my trying to maintain that balance was telling stories. And not just telling stories. I could tell stories, but telling short, concise stories that actually got to the point, as opposed to a 10-minute long rambling diatribe that connects and then detours and then comes back to the original point. And the person listening was like, what's going on? Mm-hmm. And so I want to talk about kind of what are the most common types of stories. We're going to talk about 3 different types of stories, but we're also going to talk about how and what goes into a good story. Mm-hmm. And so maybe before we get into the most common types of stories that salespeople, entrepreneurs need to tell, can you talk to me about your thoughts on what is a good story? What is from a length, beginning, middle, end kind of perspective? What are some of the high notes when you think about telling a good story?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To the first point, what you said on length. When I wrote my book, I analyzed the best stories that I've listened to in all the interviews before. And what I found there is that the average sales story is 1 minute 27. And that's not that long. And when you think of your sales story and you go about in 3, 5, 10 minutes, sure, maybe if it's an incredible story, you can do that. But otherwise, it should be a fairly short story. It should be a relatable story where the other person can see themselves in. But you want to keep it pretty concise in the sales context. Now, that being said, even though it's concise, you still want to tick some of the boxes there, right? So usually the best stories, they're emotional, they're visual, and they have some sort of element of surprise in there. Because if everything's predictable in that story, well, I've no reason to listen to you, right? But if there are some things where like, ooh, I didn't see that coming, I'm more interested to listen to the rest of the.
Talk to me about how do I make a story emotional? If I'm talking about a customer case study,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm in a B2B context, where's the emotion there? We transacted, they hired us, we did the thing, they got this value. Where's the emotion?
You can let me share one technique with you, how you can add a lot of emotions to your story. One of my favorite techniques to add emotions is called inner dialogue. And that is you share some of the thoughts that are going on in the main characters or your head, in your head. And for example, we have all these fears, worries, hopes, dreams in our heads. For the story, share some of these in the crucial moment of the story. Example, instead of just saying, oh, I'm very excited about delivering that pitch, you say, oh man, this will be the best pitch of my life, right? Everyone will look at this and think that I'm a freaking genius. One example, or let's say you delivered that pitch and it went really bad. Instead of just saying, that was a terrible pitch, you say, and everyone will think now I'm a failure, right? I should move country right now. This ain't working out for me. I'm obviously exaggerating a little bit, but you see, you can share some of these thoughts that are going on in our heads. That way, that's the easiest way to make any story more emotional.
And then the visual element, if I'm like what I sell, I'm trying to think through the lens of like predictable revenue. We sell like sales development services and like consulting. Like, how do I make that visual? Like, it's a person. His name is Diego. He's amazing on the telephone. Imagine picking up that red telephone and dialing for you.
Yeah, that's one thing that we got to worry for, right? Well, watch out for, because a lot of people, they change their entire voice. They're like, once upon a time, and was this it? And that's just completely fake. Let me share again my favorite technique to make any story more visual, especially in a customer context. For you, let's say you work with another customer. What you can then share to make it more visual is the exact words that person used, maybe in the challenge of the story or at the end. Example, 2 weeks later, the customer called you and said, wow, Collin, thank you so much. Because of your consulting, I increased my revenue now by 50%. It's insane. Thank you so much. Right? I use the direct words that customer used in that specific moment.
Right. Okay. So if I try and put this...
And that can be either at the end, so let's say when the transformation is done, or before in the challenge. So that you talk to the customer and the customer says, Collin, I don't know what's going on, but I've tried everything and nothing seems to work out here. So the direct words that we use in that specific moment.
Gotcha. So if I'm just thinking about a case study that I just wrote, or I did the interview last week, and the comment that stuck out for me, I would probably use it at the end. They were a marketing leader, and they said something along the lines of like, we love having predictable revenue around because we know that even if our like normal inbound has a bad week, we're still going to get like a number of high quality meetings from the predictable revenue team. And they love looking at the reports every Friday. And I was like, oh, wow, that stuck out for me. Is that kind of an example? So I could like land the story there, or like I would tell their story and then land it with that as like a way of making it more emotional.
Yeah, for sure. Yes. You could use that definitely as a story. What you always want to make sure is when you include this dialogue or the exact words in that moment, that you use very specific and catchy words. If you say, the customer said, da, 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 all these different things, well, it's not that memorable. But if that customer says, wow, hey, Collin, we have this major problem that we haven't been able to solve, can you stop there? Well, then it's becoming very memorable. So on dialogue, you want to use very catchy short words to make it more visual.
Okay. All right. You know what? I'll come back to this later. I was like, maybe I can look up my notes here and find it. But it was the Okay, I totally hear you. And last kind of comment on this is like the element of surprise.
Mhm.
What's the like for what I'm doing in my case studies or in my stories? I'm like, hey, we promised them this value, then we went and we did our thing, and then surprise, we delivered the value. Like, where's the surprise there? How do I how do I add the surprise? It doesn't compute up here.
Yeah.
It's a
In
bit forward.
the surprise would be if you did something that is maybe a little bit unusual. You did something working with that client, and something is something that other people would not do necessarily. And when you listen, like, oh wow, interesting. I've never heard that before. So that could be an unusual activity, or it could also be an unusual challenge of the customer, or it could be an unusual result. If you know through your consulting got them, I don't know, 10x results, well, that's pretty surprising because that doesn't happen every day. So you always want to think of either unusual activity, unusual challenge, or unusual result. It doesn't have to have all of them, but it should have one or two elements of surprise. Otherwise, it's just rather boring story.
There. And so what I'm thinking of is the surprise is maybe they made a comment about how the scripts, like the call scripts and the email messaging was different from what we would have done internally. But we said, hey, let's give it a try. And it ended up working really well, booking a number of meetings. Is that like enough of a surprise, or is that just kind of, you can do better, Collin?
I think you can do better, Collin.
I love it. This isn't pre-planned. I was, I wasn't planning on going here, so I will think I'll try and think up some better ideas when I actually put this story together.
In this case, for example, you could spice up the dialogue or the words a little bit. There you have some creative freedom. Your story should be truthful, but let's say if you want to exaggerate a little bit their reaction on the challenge or at the end, well, that's fine, right? You could choose to have a little bit more spicy words there if you wanted to include a surprise.
Okay. Got it. All right. I'll move on from that. I was like, I thought it'd be fun to have a real world example, but I don't want this to turn into like people think I'm trying to do a sneaky case study, of Larry, sneaky PR ad read. All right. So the average story is a minute, 27 seconds. It's emotional, it's visual, and there's an element of surprise. Is there just one type of story that we need to tell, or are there multiple different types of stories?
There are tons of different stories that you need to tell. But what I realized when I started on this whole storytelling journey in sales, I was overwhelmed by, hey, these are the 50 story types that you need to master. And when I saw that, I tried to think really hard and interview tons of people. Hey, what are the 3 fundamental story types that you need to know? And that's why I boiled it down to these 3 right now that I think, or what all my clients see as well, is give you the biggest results. Cool. And they're usually connection story, success story, and then, the other one, I think we didn't talk about that, but the value story, or your differentiation story.
Cool. And so what I'd love to do is kind of talk about, let's kind of go into all of them. But I guess obviously one at a time. I think we had talked about origin story, but you said sort of value story, as the third one.
Yeah.
I love that. I think from a sales perspective, starting at the top of the conversation, that sounds like the connection story, or is that the origin? So why don't we start with the sort of connection story? How do you use a story to build a connection?
Yeah, perfect. So connection stories, these are tiny stories. What happens? You and everyone, all the listeners can think right now of the last meeting that they had with a customer, right? How did the small talk go? What did you talk about? And usually it's like, hey, good morning. How are you? Good. How are you? And maybe you talk about the weather. Maybe you talk about traffic. Maybe you talk about COVID. Talk about all of these standard topics. And nothing bad with that, right? Everyone does it, but it's just standard. And with the standard, you're staying at the same level of relationship. And so what you can do instead is you can share a tiny story, one of these short, relatable stories to build a connection. Let me give you an example, okay? You want to ask me, how are you?
How you doing?
Good. Well, yesterday I had this little moment of disappointment. Yesterday, I tried out for the first time padel. It's, I think, similar to pickleball in the US. And I thought, me as a former tennis player, I'll crush it. I'll be extremely good. Well, I had every single ball in the net. I completely sucked at it. Anyway, when was the last time that you tried out a new hobby, and how was that for you? No need to respond unless you want to. But did you see there what I did? So someone asked me, how are you? And I choose to respond with this short connection story.
Interesting. And now that connection story is true today, but you could probably only milk that for, if I'm in sales, a week, maybe 2 weeks as your connection story. Especially if you're doing like a multi-call close, you don't want to be like, they're like, hey, how you doing? Be like, they'll tell the pickleball story, and you're like, did you tell that last
week? True. Yeah. At the beginning, you may be using one story a few more times, right? Or maybe this happened a week ago, but after some time, once you train yourself, you'll find these moments very quickly. And then every moment you think for it for 10 seconds, you're like, okay, that's a good story. And then you'll share that. So it gets easier with time. At the beginning, you need some prefabrication a little bit.
So let's talk about what goes into building a connection story, because it sounds like it's probably a little bit deeper than I tried something last week and it didn't go well. So help me understand, what are the things that you're looking for, and what are the components of a good connection story?
Yeah. So usually 3 components. First, transition in. Transition in is very much just one sentence where you get the other person excited, and you can say, I said, for example, I'm good. I had this, what did I say? I had this moment of disappointment yesterday. So moment of disappointment, that's already giving it some value. And you're like, ooh, what's about to come? Or if I say, I had this really interesting experience, or I read this odd article. So just one sentence that hooks your audience. That's one, transition in. Second is share your story. And the story can be anything that is more personal than weather or traffic. And that can be anything interesting that has happened lately. Maybe you picked up a new skill lately. Maybe there's some small thing that annoys you that is still fun to share, but really anything that is a little bit more personal, I'd say. The options are really infinite there. And then last step, and that's actually the hardest one, because the purpose of these connection stories is to build rapport with the other person. And you don't build rapport just by sharing a story, but you build rapport by getting the story from the other person. And so the last step, transition out, that's about asking a question where the other person can respond with a story in return. That is, for example, a story. A bad question would be, hey, how are you? That's bad, right? Because you wouldn't respond with a story. Or if I say, so how was your day? That doesn't get a story in return. But if I ask, hey, when was the last time that, I don't know, you went on a holiday with your family, and how was that? Or when was the last time you tried a new sport? So all these, when was the last time, they ask for a specific moment and time. And that way you get a story in response. Also, if you ask for, let's say, the favorite or least favorite, best, worst, all of these extreme experiences, well, you'll get a very interesting story in response. So just to recap, it's transition in, share your story, and then transition out. And the one piece that is the most important, but the one that most people actually mess up, that's the transition out part. The question is the hardest. Every single time in a workshop, that's the one where people struggle with the most.
I think this is one of the things I struggle with the most in general in my sales career, which was I was really great at telling the story or really great at sharing a thing, but then I would just end. And everybody's like, what are we supposed to do with what you said? Cool, great. And then somebody changes the topic. There was no consistently, I guess as the salesperson, as somebody who's kind of leading the call, you want to tell them what's next. Sort of like I'm running a podcast. I've got the kind of outline in front of me. I know roughly how to do this, and I'm going to lead you to where we're going to go next.
Exactly. We're on that sales call. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's surprising. The question you need to prepare in advance, and not only for connection stories, but for any stories. You want to make sure, okay, how can I transition out of that? Because as you right now just said, people make it so awkward. They're like, all right, so that's my story. They get a standing ovation. They get very awkward about it, right? And so you want to make it as smooth as possible for the other person. So, in the connection story, it's about asking them if they had an experience similar to that, or what was their experience like. And for the others, we'll talk about how you can transition out of these stories.
Gotcha. And so is the transition in, share the story, transition out kind of framework, is that going to be similar through the other two story types? Or does it vary a little bit?
It varies a little bit. Connection stories, because these are tiny stories. It's not big story structure. It's not big on the elements. It is a different structure. For the other two, I use the same structure.
Okay.
But
and then from a timing perspective with the connection story, is there like is it minute 27 as well, or do these tend to be shorter?
They're tiny. They're 30 seconds, maybe 60 seconds if it's an incredible story, but these are really, really short. Because when someone asks you, how are you? And you start sharing, 3 minutes of what happened. The person, I didn't ask for that. What are you sharing?
You just take 10% of the call with a connection story. It's a 30-minute call.
It's also, people are at the beginning a little bit skeptical, right? They're like, oh man, this is awkward. I don't want to talk about myself unsolicited. This is weird. But what I'd suggest everyone, hey, the cool thing is you can try them out so easily. Every one of us is being asked every single day, multiple times, hey, how are you? So try for yourself. For myself and for my clients, I'd say 8 out of 10 times, very positive interaction. 2 out of 10 times, maybe neutral reaction, where it's like, okay, cool. Hey, let's go into business. But never have I had a bad experience with these type of connection stories.
And what's the value of, or I guess like we talked about the objective is to kind of build a rapport. I guess what's your ideal outcome here? Like you share a story, they share a story, and then like I guess what is that helping us accomplish? I'd just love to kind of frame out the value before we move on to the next one.
Yeah. It's getting to know each other on a deeper level. Ideally, something that matters to that other person. The person knows something more about you. And even, let's say, months later, you still remember that one thing about that person. It just makes all future interaction much smoother. And the other person will also be more positive throughout the conversation because you've already created this mutual bond at the beginning.
Got it. Love that. Show a little bit of vulnerability maybe in your story choice of like, hey, I used to be good at tennis, now I'm terrible at pickleball.
Yeah. Yeah, vulnerability is always a good one, especially in sales, right? Where people are like, we're the coolest on earth. If you just share this something as well where you're maybe not the greatest, that's usually pretty refreshing.
Totally. Yeah, I won an Olympic gold medal yesterday. I'm like, really? Did you?
Yeah.
I love it. And so if we're following from the top of the sales conversation, we start with kind of building that connection and getting deeper in. I think one of the hard ones that I even struggle with at the beginning, top of the call. I mean, in fairness, I'm doing enough, case study notes that haven't been written down yet. But is the customer story. So help me understand what goes into a really good customer story.
Yeah. Before we do that, just one thing, because you mentioned as well, before you share the success story, you got to do a really thorough diligence on, hey, what's going on with your buyer? If you're just sharing that story out of nowhere and just a random story, that's completely useless and often counterproductive in sales. What you want to make sure is you're very aware of the pain points of that customer, exactly what is going on with them, what do they want, what is impacting them. And once you know that, you can then go to your success story and you can say, Collin, interesting. That reminds me a little bit of a similar customer I had 2 years back. Would it be helpful if I shared what problems that customer was going through? And then I go into the story. So yes, listening there is absolutely key. Otherwise, you will share an irrelevant story. But yeah, let's go to what makes, how to craft these success stories. So I follow 4 steps for these success stories, and that's usually context, challenge, response, and result. And context, it's very quickly about giving some rough context. When does it take place? Who's the main character? What does the main character want in the situation or in life? That's the first step. Very brief. Don't waste too much time, because I've seen lots of salespeople just giving context for like 5 minutes. And that's most of the times it's not needed. That can be done in really a few sentences. you want to move as quickly as possible to the second step, which is challenge. And challenge, that's what is the main pain point, right? That customer or the main character is going through. But that's the most important part of any story. That's the part where you go a little bit deeper into the emotion. Very, very important. Fourth, response. That's how does the main character respond to that challenge, or how do you help him go through that challenge? What are the actions, reactions, decision taken to overcome that challenge? And then fourth step and last step, result. That's how does it turn out at the end? How is, let's say, your client's life transformed? How does this situation turn out at the end? So just to recap, it's context, challenge, response, and result.
Interesting. Okay. This reminds me a lot of a book I read, and it's not unique to Nancy Duarte, but I can see the visual of, she plotted out the hero's journey on and I feel like these are the kind of the high level, the context, the challenge, the response, the result, kind of similar. The book I think was called Resonate. So if anybody's sitting here listening, like, I'd really love to see a visual, the one that's coming to mind, I think it stuck with me because it talked about Star Wars. Is this something that's in your book? You got some visuals to kind of help people along the way?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a really cool book, Nancy Duarte's book on Resonate. What I don't like that much about Hero's Journey, because back in the days when I started on storytelling, I had tons of business storytelling courses teach the Hero's Journey. And that's a 12-step story structure. It's completely crazy to think that anyone in business has the time to go through 12-step story structure. Sure, if you tell your incredible TED Talk, hey, go for it. But for business settings, you need to, I'm indifferent of what type of story structures you choose in business as long as it's simple. 3-step, 4-step, 5-step. That's it. I wouldn't go any further than that.
100% strongly agree. I think the thing I would love to kind of drive towards is like I think the thing that I learned from the hero's journey was that I'm not the main character. I think that was a hard thing for a selfish person with a big ego to, I'm the salesperson. I'm going to close this deal. I know everything about the product. I'm going to sell you something, it was really hard for me to think or to come to that realization that the story isn't about me. I'm the little green guy, right? The customer is Luke Skywalker. And I think that's more so than the actual number of steps or what the visuals looked like. I think that was the realization that I came to. And I love that you kind of have that here, is that the main character is not me in this story, correct?
Yes. That's the customer. I like that quote from Nancy Duarte. I think she said there that the customer is Luke Skywalker and you're Yoda, right? Or something like that. Maybe I'm making this up right now.
No, exactly. That was, it may not be word for word, but that was the piece that really stuck with me. Yeah, that you're not Luke. You are somebody else. So set the context for me, or help me understand the context, right? When we're talking about a customer, you said this is a very short period or a very short section of the story. So what goes into this? Like, what are the high points or the main points you want to cover? Customer was James. Their title was this at this kind of company, that sort of thing.
Yeah, perfect.
Detail, just the high level.
That's it. Maybe, yes, location, time. That usually adds credibility. If you say October 2021, New York, in the office, blah, 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 that immediately gives it credibility. If you just say, once one time a customer, well, that just makes it, is that even a real story? And then the one thing that you can add there as well is, what does that customer want, right? Because yes, it's a customer. Maybe you don't know that much about, but all of the customers, everyone, these are people, right, that have specific goals in their life, in their jobs. And so maybe share one or two things about that customer, what that customer wants. That way we'll care more. If we know nothing about the customer, it's very hard to empathize with him or her.
Got it. Okay. And so we set the context, who, when, where. I had never considered that time and location would add credibility, but listeners, when Philip was just sharing and he said, it was 2021 in New York, like I suddenly felt like I'm in not just I'm not listening to a case study. I'm almost in like a Batman movie, where it's like the intro to the movie and you're like picturing yourself there as opposed to just listening to a case study. I wonder, is that it? Yeah. Is there anything behind that? The reason you do that or it? Yeah.
It's mostly just to add not credibility, but just to help the listener stop worrying whether it's a true story or not. If you bring in date and location or time and location, there you immediately, it's a true story. I can stop worrying about that. I can just now listen to you 100%.
Right. Interesting. I had never considered that. I'm a fairly visual person. So when you said, it's 2021 New York, I was instantly like picturing like zooming in on the city. Anyway, I think I'm going too deep into the context here where we're supposed to keep this a little bit short. I need to add on the context.
You just said there, interestingly, not everyone chooses to do so, but you can make the context very visual as well if you start in action. If you say start into action means that the main character is doing some sort of thing. Let's say October 2021, I'm in my apartment in Amsterdam. I just hit send, close down my laptop and take a big breath, right? That way you're like, this is very visual. You can now see it in front of your eyes. So you see, starting right into the action, you use words, verbs to get into the scene. But that's, I think, a little bit already more advanced. Maybe we're confusing it some.
Yeah, I'm picturing myself telling this case study story and be like, our customer, James, just closed their laptop. And they're like, wait, were you there? This is before they met you? Like, wait a minute. How were you there? Creeper.
Yeah.
Anyway, moving on to the challenge. So help me understand. So we've set the context where it's 2021. We're in New York. The customer had just closed their laptop. How do we describe the challenge? I understand the idea. This is like what the pain point of what the customer is trying to get through. What are the core critical pieces of describing the challenge?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that could be, if you have that conversation with the customer, that could be the challenge. You're having that conversation with that customer and the customer comes to you and says, Collin, I don't know what's going on, but the last 3 months, I haven't closed a single deal. I mean, that's bad. If I continue like that, I can sell my company right now, right? That, for example, that could be the challenge then. You don't need to talk much more about that, but if you have this punchy dialogue in there to describe the challenge, that's usually very powerful for the challenge, for customer stories.
Gotcha. And so this is coming back to your making it kind of visual. The customer told me we haven't closed a deal in 3 months. And if we don't, or if we don't start closing, then we're going to have to XYZ.
Yeah. But you don't have to use the dialogue, but you want to share about, hey, what's at stake? What's the problem? Why does it matter so much? And that should be also, why does it matter to that customer? If you just say, it's so bad because they could lose 10% revenue, that doesn't really matter to the customer, right? But if that could mean that, well, that customer doesn't get his promotion or her promotion and maybe has to find a new job, well, then it immediately gets much more emotional. So you want to think, can I somehow increase the stakes, obviously without twisting the truth here, but is there a deeper emotion behind it? And usually behind every person, there is a deeper emotion behind it.
How do you balance the, adding the emotion, but also not adding too much, as a salesperson, I want to come across as candid, and and truthful. And I think I think my concern is over emotion or sensualizing something. You run the risk of the person who's receiving it is like, oh man, they're really dramatizing this 10% revenue increase. Yeah. So what's the balance? What's the right balance there?
Yeah. That everyone has to find a little bit their own style of how much emotion they want to include there. But I'd say don't go crazy on the emotions. Instead, use just very catchy, short sentence. It's not that talk about the emotion now for 5 minutes, how everyone is crying, but instead use just 1 or 2 sentences that just show what is at stake.
Got it. And I guess show what is at stake and keep the customer looking in a positive light as opposed to they didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And so how do we segue this into the response? So we've set the context, we've described the challenge in one or two sentences. How do we frame up the response?
The response would then be, hey, we have this problem. And then it's when you come in a little bit. That's when you as the guide come in and you say, hey, I have the solution. It could work, but I'm not sure. You want to try it out? And then you try it out. And so then it's really when you come in. And sometimes it could be, usually the customer is skeptical as well, right? Pretty much all the time. It's never that they're like, you have a solution, perfect. So you can share as well in that response some of the skepticism or at the beginning. That will just make it even more credible, the story. Otherwise, like, problem, solution, done. That's a little bit too easy. So if you want to share that it was actually, you did some convincing behind it, that's more relatable.
Love that. It's funny. Almost every customer case study I've done, the customer will say, "Hey, yeah, we were skeptical that outbound would work for us because X, Y, and Z." I think that's probably true about. I guess, is that just unique to outbound, or is that unique to every situation?
That's just you, Collin. Never did interview back in.
I do not instill trust in people. Understand? Gonna go cry. Thank you.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's normal, right? I would be the same. I think someone who doesn't have any skepticism, I don't think that they can be very successful in business. Hope I'm not pissing someone off right now.
No. That totally makes a ton of sense here. And so we've set the context, we shared the challenge, and then response, we frame up, we had the solution and we thought it might work, or maybe it would work, but the client was skeptical. How do we close out the sort of response? But they decided to do it anyway, or like...
Yeah, and then you just say, okay, eventually they decided, they agreed to try it out, and then tell a little bit more. How did they try it out? What were the actions? What actually did you work on? Also, don't share there the million things that you did, because often we're like, problem, and then the 10 things that we did to overcome that problem. There you want to keep it pretty concise as well. So what are the 1 or 2 actions that really move the needle here?
Can you give me an example of like yeah.
So let's say if I coach someone and they come to me, I do, let's say, 20 different things to help them become a better storyteller. If I were to share a story right now, I would then say, well, the next day we worked on 3 stories. 1, to build a connection. 2, to share with the customer. And 3, to overcome objections. With these 3 stories, So I wouldn't share all the other things. I would focus in on very simple actions that we did to overcome the problem. I wouldn't share everything, but really simplify the actions to 1 or 2 actions.
Gotcha. Okay. That's probably the part where I get the most hung up, is in, well, we did this for them, and then we did this, and then this is how that works, and then this is how that works. And then now you're like 6 minutes in, you're like, well, I've blown through my minute 27.
Yeah. There, it's tough at the beginning, but you got to find the 1 or 2 things that really change the. And either way, you'll have a conversation after that on all of the cool stuff that you offer. So you need to share everything yet.
Okay, that's a good point. And then the result. So getting to the result, how do we frame this one up?
The result is with a success story. That's how is the client changed at the end? How is the pain point solved? What is the outcome or the result that they have unlocked now with your help? And that could be, hey, they increased their revenue, they improved their production process, anything, how their life is changed right now. There you want to show the transformation. A transformation for, let's say, being lost to now feeling good again, feeling grateful, being happy. Sorry. And again, that's a beautiful part, especially for success stories, to include that these direct words. These direct words were, hey, 2 weeks later, I met with this guy, and he said, wow, thank you so much. This was incredible. I love working with you guys. This has been the most awesome experience ever. Obviously, again, making fun of this, but you want to share some dialogue of at the end how your relationship also is transformed.
How their relationship transformed, and then words of the customer.
Yeah.
Love this. And this is one that you can get out in a minute 27.
Mm, 2 minutes is good as well. I'd say 2 minutes is good as well, but usually shorter, the better. Mm.
Can I put you on the spot and ask you to share a customer story or a customer success story of your own?
Sure, absolutely. Let me think which one. Okay, cool. Actually, as you're from Canada, let me share a story of someone from Canada.
Sounds good, eh?
Sounds good. So when was that? I think April 2021. I hopped on this coaching call with this woman, Ezra, customer success manager from Canada, and immediately I'm greeted with this bundle of energy, right? Very high energy, super charismatic. And I'm already thinking, how am I supposed to help her? She should be coaching me. Anyway, we talk a little bit, and at one point, I asked her to share a story. Immediately, when I say story, just this big ball of energy just shrinks to this pile of misery. I'm like, what's going on here? After the story, I asked her, what happened, Ezra? She told me that when that she's afraid how other people would make fun of her. We talked a little bit more. It turned out that she moved from Iraq to Canada when she was 12 years old, and that people were making fun of her English in these early days, and that somehow stuck. When she told me that, I knew that there's no point of working on the structure, no point of working on these elements. We need to work on her self-limiting beliefs. And so what we focused on was, how could we rewrite the story that she tells herself? So at the end of the session, I asked her, hey, Esther, do you want to share maybe another story? She shared that story. When she's done, I just look at her like, wow, Ezra, this was beautiful, right? This is a cool story. You're a great storyteller. And she just looks at me and just says, thanks so much, right? I think she didn't realize it back then herself. Anyway, that's the story. I hope I wasn't crazy long now. Would be
Harold, I didn't pull the timer out, but I think you're pretty close. And thank you. And for the audience, I didn't actually. Sometimes we set up the kind of framework for these conversations, and then I just go with my natural curiosity. And this is one of those times I'm like, hey, I'm gonna surprise you a couple times with some questions that are a little bit off the book here. So I appreciate the pulling a story ad hoc out of the air here.
No, I'm happy to share.
We've talked about the success story. Maybe we land with, because I think we're getting close to time, and I want to be respectful of your time. I do feel like we could talk about stories forever. Let's land with the value story. What are the core components? I guess before we get into the components, what is a value story? Because we just talked about customer success story. Isn't that the same thing?
Yeah. Value story, or I call them differentiation story, they help share what is so unique about working with you. Sure, maybe that is covered sometimes in the success story, but most of the times it's, let's say there's something unique about working with you. Your customer, before making any decision, they need to know why should they work with you? Why should they bother to be in a relationship with you? They need to understand. And what most people do is they're like, again, we're the market leader. We have the super cool outbound system. And they bring facts in there. That's a beautiful part where you want to share a story of a value that you represent. So how do you craft them? It's first about thinking, what claim do you want to make? That could be, hey, I'm a consultant to your business, not a salesperson, or I'm here for you 24/7. Whatever is your claim that you want to make. And then think, is there an experience in my past that would back up that claim? And then looking to your past, think, is there any moment where that would help me bring that claim to life? And then once you have that claim, you can structure it in the same way as we did with the success story. But then you have your moment, then you have your differentiation story.
Okay, so we start with something unique about you as a company, and then what claim, and then so figuring out like what claim do we want to make here, whether it's 24/7 service, or the best value in town, or or something along those lines. Then you go and you decide you pick an experience from your past that would kind of back that up and then bring it to life.
Absolutely, that's it.
Okay, and so talk to me about, how do you choose that story, that experience, and then how do you frame up that experience?
Yeah, I'd say most of the companies, they either way have these claims. if you look on someone's website, everyone has these blank, meaningless statements that are floating around. And then just think, hey, I have this claim. Is there anything how I could back that up? And that could be on the company overall or for you personal, right? Maybe you have a certain claim that you want to communicate. And so that could be either the company's claim or your own claims. And then think about, hey, is there any experience in my past where I lived that value, where I acted in an exemplary way, where I did something that stood out a little bit?
Can I throw an idea to you and see if this is unique enough? And it kind of comes to like, I'm trying to see if this works, or if I'm off base and misunderstanding. So one thing that I think is a bit different about predictable revenue is the framework, the methodology. And I haven't done a great job of sharing it out, but we're working on that. The belief here is that sales and in sales growth, sales development is a chain link system. So you could call it revenue, you could call it whatever, but it's a chain link system of 4 key processes: meet, disco, manage, nurture. Is this along the lines of the thinking, or is this too out there?
So your value is that sales process consists of these 4 steps.
I think what's unique about working with us is that we understand that sales is a chain link system, and that in order to be successful with predictable revenue or with sales development in general, you need to do 4 things right. And booking meetings is only the first step.
Got it. So do you think that most people would understand, let's say, chain link system?
I think you know what a chain link fence is. So
I for example, don't know what it is. But maybe
how dare you not know what's going on in my brain?
Maybe it's because here I'm in Amsterdam. But let's say you want to pick something where the other person, especially for your story, that is very simple. And what it seems right now, sure, that could be very interesting for someone that is already a little bit more to the weeds. But I try to pick something where that is a little bit more, let's say, more emotional, more about you, how you work, right? Because I think you have tons of examples there, and I wouldn't go into the technicalities there that much yet. The technicalities I would save then for really the demo.
Gotcha. Okay. And so we pick something unique about ourselves. We look at like, what claim do we, and like, what is the claim that we want to make? And then we find the story. And so help me, I want to zoom in on, once we decided, okay, this is the claim. How do we frame up that claim? Like, is it the same framework as before, the context, challenge, response, result, customer story?
Yes, it's exactly the same structure. The only difference is this time the protagonist or the main character could be yourself, could be the customer, depends, but there's a little bit more flexibility.
Awesome. So can you, if I can put you on the spot again for yourself, could you tell me the value or differentiation story about Philipp, either through your consulting services, coaching services, or your book?
Yeah, sure. Let me think. Okay. So I think there are a lot of different ones, but let me share one that I used to share for some time. And that is the value that I would want to communicate is that I only work when leadership is fully on board. And the story that I will share is that, hey, when was it? I think 3 years back, true though. In Amsterdam, I gave a workshop for this very big organization. Lots of people in the crowd. And it's this full day workshop. It consists of a smaller workshop and also a keynote. And I think, hey, this is cool, right? Everyone is on board. This will be super exciting to have all these people now listen to me. What happens is that leadership, well, they said that they wanted to participate, but they actually didn't participate at the end. And so they only made the announcement at the beginning with, hey, welcome, Philipp. But then they just left. They didn't participate in the full training. And so doing this training there, in the moment, it was one of the worst trainings I've given in my life. Not because it was not interactive, not fun, but the impact after was one of the worst that I've seen across all my programs. And why is that? Well, it's because leadership wasn't on board. What I learned from that experience is if I give workshops, I want leadership to be 100% on board. Other than that, the trainings are useless. And so if you really commit to some program like that, leadership has to be all in.
Love that. I want to pull it up a little bit and talk about, just kind of land the episode with, let's talk about the impact you've seen these stories have. Obviously, you've been teaching people how to tell stories. You've been telling stories yourself. You've got your book. Help me understand the difference that you've seen in people's personal lives, professional lives, by just changing the way that they tell these stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What the biggest change that I see, and the one thing that I struggled the most with is that people realize that they can tell stories very quickly. At the beginning, everyone's like, oh, I need to have this perfect story that I share now and everyone will love me after that. I think the biggest change that I see from people working with me is that on day one, they start sharing these tiny stories. And sure, they are not perfect. They can be improved, but they get the work done. After some time, you can refine them. But what I realized that by enabling people immediately to start sharing stories in their day-to-day, they'll get much more confident, and they already see much more beautiful interactions coming up with all their customers. So that's, I think, the biggest change that I see with people, that they start straight away with these small stories and see the much deeper connection with their customers through that.
I love that. Philipp, I really appreciate you coming on the show and talking to us about stories. You've got a book called The Story Selling Method, not Storytelling Method, that I screwed up in our pre-interview. Where can people find the book? And if people are looking for help, advice, coaching on story selling or storytelling, how do they get in touch with you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the book you can find on Amazon. And if people want to get in touch with me, they can find me on LinkedIn. That's usually the easiest. Philipp Humm, Humm. And also check out my website. I think right now, storyselling.and. And there, just hit me up, and I'd be happy to answer any questions and to help anyone advance on this storytelling journey.
Right on. Well, Philipp, thank you so much for coming on the show and telling your story. We appreciate it. And thank you.
Thanks a ton for having me.
Right on. And thanks to everybody for listening, and we'll see you all next week.